Let's go. What's up? What's up, y'all? What's up, y'all? Tonight we're covering, we're doing a pretty massive stream here. I don't know how massive it'll be, but it covers a massive amount of material. So tonight we're diving into Shakespeare's Henriad. Okay, now what does that mean? Well, this is really Shakespeare's epic. Okay, and it covers a series of plays. So we are focusing mainly on the Shakespearean triad, which is Richard II, Henry IV, Part 1, and Henry IV, Part 2. The Tetralogy, that would be the trilogy, the triad. The Tetralogy would be Richard II, Henry IV, Part 1, Henry IV, Part 2, and Henry V. So we'll also be diving into a little bit of Henry V tonight, even though we've already covered a lot of Henry V way early in the life of this stream. Of course, we did that when we were doing various Shakespearean speeches and soliloquies. So, but we're going to dive back into it tonight because it's important for understanding Shakespeare's epic. Now, the entire Henriad would actually cover, it would actually start, you would think it would start with King John, but King John was written so early in the Shakespearean career that it doesn't really fit in. But really it would be Richard II, Henry IV, Part 1, Henry IV, Part 2, Henry V, Henry VI, Part 1, Henry VI, Part 2, Richard III, and then we can also include sort of Henry VIII as part of that. So that's 8 plays. Now, that's a little interesting because the epic really concerns Henry V. And we've, of course, done an epic stream before here in terms of we've talked about epic literature. We did, we covered Beowulf, and Beowulf is usually considered the English epic poem. So we're gonna dive into what that means to have an epic poem. You know, the national ideas of the epic poem, and why Beowulf is such, and why we can actually consider this really the true English epic. We're also going to talk about the nationalistic and propagandistic elements of the play, and then how they were used later in World War II. We're going to talk about King Henry V, Henry V, right? St. Crispin's Day speech, which we've talked about. But we're going to talk about Henry V as the English national epic hero who really brings England from out of the Middle Ages, out of the medieval era and into the Renaissance, which then takes it into the Elizabethan era where England becomes the empire. It's the origin of the English empire. And that is a completely different, we have a lot to say about that as well. A lot of scholars do. But what that also means, and we're going to discuss this fairly in depth, I guess, if we can say that. We're going to discuss really what that means in terms of why Henry V is the central hero, what that means for the national elements of England, and also the differences between the epic and the chronicle, because scholars will say that this actually is more of a chronicle than a history, even though these fit into the Shakespearean history category. So we've done, I mean, this is like maybe our, 14th Shakespeare stream here, our 14th Shakespearean analysis, 13th or 14th. We've covered all the major tragedies. We've covered Macbeth, Othello, King Lear, Hamlet. We've covered some romances or tragicomedies in The Tempest and Antony and Cleopatra. We've also done Julius Caesar. We've talked about Richard III, Henry V. We've done John Webster. So we've done a fair bit here of Renaissance or Elizabethan literature, verse. We're going to discuss also the differences between the Shakespearean history and the actual history. And it's important to keep in mind that this is a drama, right? It's literature. So there are certain liberties taken, of course, that differ from the let's say we talk about, I don't know, Holinshed's Chronicles or Geoffrey of Monmouth or any of Shakespeare's sources, or the more recent or contemporaneous sources for Shakespeare. So Shakespeare wrote 37 plays. I plan to, hopefully we can keep going in the channel for a long time and eventually cover all of them. And this is just for, your edification and for, it's interesting because these are more difficult plays. I know Shakespeare well, and these are more difficult plays for me to cover than, let's say, something like Macbeth. I mean, Macbeth is so phantasmagorical and so visceral and so, vivacious. It like this, the text speaks to me so, or to readers and especially to the audience. It's important to keep in mind there's an audience that it's fairly simple in terms of understanding the play. Now, the deeper analysis obviously takes it takes some depth, I guess you would say. Sorry to be redundant. But another thing is that the villains, the idea of the villains in these plays is a little difficult to grasp because we don't have a villain like we do with, let's say, Grendel and Grendel's mother in Beowulf. We actually we have a series of civil wars, and that will play into the reason that I titled the stream the way that I did, the Demi-Paradise, because it's obvious that one of the themes that runs throughout these plays through Shakespeare's Henriad, or like Harold Bloom calls it, the FALSTAFFIAD, because Henry actually doesn't appear until Henry IV, Part 1, and Falstaff, of course, doesn't appear in Henry V for a reason. We'll discuss that as well. But one of the things is that, like, when you get a Shakespearean villain, it's easy to get the good guys and the bad guys, right? I mean, one thing that I think Northrop Frye, the great academic Frye, said about Richard III and some of the villainy that goes on in these plays is that, like, Richard III is so villainous that if he were in the plays, or if he were alive during that time, he was alive later, but he would just he would just sweep people out of his sight. It's just barefaced villainy. And that's one thing that we can grasp about Richard III. Another thing is that, like, when you take a villain like Iago, of course we've covered Othello, but when you take a villain like Iago is so bad, right? He's such a true villain. But one thing is that there's no lying in him, right? His lies are all stratagems and cutthroat, but when he speaks no lies, if that makes sense. He's true in his villainy. Milton says of his Satan that when he basically paraphrasing, when he plumbs the depths of himself, there are more depths that open. This is not true of the villainy in these plays because, of course, this is a history play. And so, just to start from the beginning, I suppose, remember that Shakespeare has really three genres, right? Three categories of drama. The tragedy, obviously, the comedy, and then, of course, the history. Most people, especially most people new to Shakespeare, will often forget about the historical genre. But it is one of Shakespeare's central and longest genre. I mean, look, Henry IV Part 2 itself is, like, incredibly long. Now, Hamlet is obviously Shakespeare's longest play, the tragedy. But we've talked about the differences between tragedy and comedy before. We're going to discuss some of that again as we go on. And then later, a kind of a fourth genre that Shakespeare wholly invents is the tragicomedy, which seems oxymoronic, but it's the tragicomedy or the romance in terms of the Romanesque play, right? Which would be something like The Tempest, Antony and Cleopatra, The Winter's Tale, etc. And what that basically means is that just as a brief overview, the differences between tragedy and comedy in Shakespeare are the line is so thin because the comedies actually have more of a tragic element in them, or a tragic element in them, than many of the tragedies do, because the slightest thing could send the whole play, like, off the edge. It could be incredibly tragic if it didn't end if it didn't have a happy ending, which is what makes it a comedy, right? And we've discussed before, of course, especially when we did Dante's Inferno. Remember, we did a stream on Dante's Inferno, where in the Divine Comedy, the reason it's called the Divine Comedy, of course, is that Dante ends in Paradiso, right? He ends. There's a happy ending. He ends in heaven. Of course, in the Shakespearean tragedies and in the classic, or in the Shakespearean comedies and the classic comedies, the play will usually end in a wedding, right? I mean, look at Much Ado About Nothing, for example, or look at the comedic ending, which is the happy ending of Midsummer Night's Dream, which is another play that we need to cover. But these plays are interesting because they are historical. They're based in history. But of course, one of the things we're going to talk about tonight is going to be the movie, the 2019 movie, The King, by David Michod, who I think is Australian, starring Joel Edgerton and what's the guy's name? Timothy Chalamet. And actually, I didn't, just to give a brief statement about that movie, like, I didn't really like the movie when it came out. I've seen it, I think, 3 times now. I didn't like it when it came out. And then I watched it again, and I understood what they were doing a little bit better. And then I watched it again recently, and I really appreciated it. I really liked the movie for a number of reasons. Obviously, it's a retelling of Shakespeare. It's not a historical movie in the sense that it is about the 100 Years' War and then the War of the Roses, or rather about the ascension of Henry V and his sort of apotheosis, which, of course, it's not even worth saying, but it doesn't match Shakespeare, obviously, because it's a 2-hour truncated version in a film of sort of updated with the sentiments, with the contemporary sentiments, right? Sort of postmodern and Great Reset sentiments, but it's interesting that they do that and they keep the fictional character of Falstaff. And Falstaff, of course, is one of Shakespeare's greatest and most magnificent, magnanimous, one of his largest, literally large. He's rotund. He's this huge globular character that Orson Welles actually captured pretty well in his offshoot film, Chimes at Midnight, if you guys haven't seen that or heard of it. Remember there was a documentary about Orson Welles that came out I think 3 years ago, almost 4 years ago, about Orson Welles' making of Chimes at Midnight and sort of his latter life. And Orson Welles, if any actor is a Falstaffian character, it would be Orson Welles. Remember, have you seen the Orson Welles commercial? Frozen peas. They make the champagne. I'm not doing it justice, but Falstaff is one of those characters that, remember, it's important to keep in mind this is drama, right? It's meant to be performed, which sets it aside from the usual literature that we cover here, because Shakespeare is meant to be. I mean, Frye and Bloom make an excellent case for the fact that Shakespeare is meant solely to be performed, right? And that is obviously valid. I mean, that's one reason for the lack of publication of the plays in his lifetime. But one thing that I think is that, and this isn't new. I'm sure many people think this, but that Shakespeare is like poetry is in general, in the sense that it's meant to be seen on the page and heard aloud. But the extra bit, the extra thing with Shakespeare, the bit that puts it over the top, is that it is also performed, and that's why it's so difficult to determine Shakespeare's own worldview because of the universe of his characters. I mean, there are 37 plays, and he gets at every human emotion, every activity, every situation so well. And I think that keeping that in mind in terms of the production and the performance of Shakespearean plays, like the actor's dream, this is speaking from someone who's been to drama school. This is about the only thing I can say, is that every actor, especially every classical actor's dream, is to play one of two characters or both characters. Hamlet, of course, and Iago is kind of how the saying goes. But Falstaff is one of those characters that resists performance in the amateur sense. And what I mean by that is many people's idea of Shakespeare or their perception of Shakespeare is in a way kind of ruined by the amateur production or the school production that you see when you're young. You see some school production of Romeo and Juliet, and that's appropriate. They're teenagers, but you cannot have a young person playing Falstaff. You just can't, because Falstaff himself would say that he is not old. He speaks the language of the young, but he's an old fat man. You just can't fake it. It takes life experience. And one of the things that I was kind of disappointed in with the Hollow Crown, which I watched all 8 hours of the first four. The first four episodes are Richard II through Henry V. But one of the things I was disappointed in is the performance by Jason Russell Beale, who's a great British actor, but I just don't think he was. This is my little bit of like criticism of the show, if that counts for anything. Is that he wasn't cast properly, or maybe that's just my perception. When I think of Falstaff, I think of this like literally larger than life character. He's supposed to be huge in every way. He's big and fat, but he's also tall. And one thing that bugged me was that Tom Hiddleston's Hal, or Henry V, like looks down literally because he's taller than Falstaff. And I get why they chose to do that, because figuratively and then later literally, Hal will grow up to become Henry V, and when he ascends the throne, he looks down on Falstaff. That's his final act, is the banishment of Falstaff. But I didn't like that the childish Hal, or Harry, as you call Henry, is like looking down on him. I thought that it was just weird. He's supposed to be looking up. Like, that's the reason Falstaff is this like sort of replacement father figure for Henry IV, like in terms of his relationship with Henry V, right? Okay, so let's dive into the plays. Okay, so what are the plays about? I'll try to give just a basic overview of what the plays are about. Well, Richard, this takes place, of course, after 1215, after King John, after the Magna Carta, and we're getting into the 100 Years' War and then the War of the Roses. And the War of the Roses was a war between the cadet branches of the Plantagenet family, right? So we have, I think I'm right. I get confused forgive me if I get any names or facts wrong when I'm watching this. I mean, when I'm doing this analysis, because there are so many names and so many families and so many situations. But the Plantagenets fought against the Lancasters, of course, and the play begins with Richard II. Richard II ascends the throne, and Richard II is obviously a fake and gray character, okay, and probably was in real life. I mean, he married, I think, Catherine of Valois, but had no issue. He had no children, and basically what happened was the kingdom started to fall apart because of the inner warring of the nobles, and he just couldn't keep it together. So what happens is Richard III banishes Henry Bolingbroke, and Henry Bolingbroke has a problem with this guy Percy, okay? And the play begins with them having a beef in front of Richard II, who brings them to the court and says, "What's your beef?" And they fight. And then he banishes Henry to Ireland. Henry Bolingbroke is not happy about this, and basically what ends up happening is he leads an army, comes back, and he deposes Richard II. Richard II is then sent to a dark tower, and is said to have died of starvation in the tower. Meanwhile, Henry Bolingbroke becomes Henry IV. He ascends the throne, and then that proceeds into Henry IV Part 1 and Part 2, where Henry has a very difficult time doing the same thing, keeping the kingdom together. And the reason for this is that they've been at relative peace, and he says to Henry V, before he dies, he essentially says, "Look, when you become king, make sure that you follow through with the crusade, go on the crusade. Because apart from the things that we all know about the crusades, right? Apart from the pilgrimage and the religious reasons and all this stuff, one of the geopolitical reasons is that if you take everyone on the crusade, and if you can't get them to a crusade, at least claim what's rightfully yours, according to these dudes, in France and go to war in France, because that will divert the attention and the energy of the nobles, and they'll have something to fight against. We'll have an enemy, and that will stop them from fighting in a civil war. So he has a hard time keeping it all together in Henry IV, Part 1, where he is going to give his kingdom over to his elder son, Henry V's, who later becomes Henry V's, Hal's older brother, younger brother, because Hal is a rapscallion. He's a young man. He's privileged. He's a privileged elite, and he loves going to the pubs and the bars. He loves going out clubbing. He loves going out clubbing with his gang of merry pranksters, Falstaff, Poins, Pistol, and all these other fellas, right? Bardolph. And all they do is go and get, they just go and get wasted, right? And that's because Henry has nothing else to do, and he doesn't like his dad. His dad's a real bastard. But what happens is he decides to take up arms and fight against, is it Hotspur? He fights against Hotspur, who lays claim to the throne wants to take over from Henry IV, because Henry IV has banished his brother Mortimer and won't let him back into the kingdom. I know this is a lot, okay, but essentially he raises an army and we have a civil war, and Henry V fights in single combat and wins. Okay, so he gets the favor of his father, and then his brother is killed in Wales in a campaign in Wales. So now it's left up to Henry to become king. So then Henry IV dies, and Henry V, becomes king. And then we have, in Henry V, we have, of course, the battle against the French Dauphin. And what happens in that is essentially that after Henry becomes king, he is given a bunch of presents from the various, royals all over the place. His sister is, I think, Queen of Bohemia. But anyway, so he gets all his presents, but then he gets a box, and in the box he gets a present from the Dauphin, who is obviously the prince in France, his counterpart. But because there's a sort of a counterplay here, because Henry IV has a counterpart in France, and then they both have young sons, and Hal and the Dauphin are kind of similar, but they go in different directions, and Hal becomes king, and then the Dauphin sends a pair of tennis balls to Henry V. This really happened. And this was seen as a huge insult because, obviously you're supposed to give your gift to the new king. And the tennis balls were a couple of things. One, and it's funny that, he was sent tennis balls in the 1400s, right? We don't think of the game as being that old, but whatever. He sent a pair of tennis balls, and these are supposed to be a sort of a few different things. One, they are a symbol of the fact that the Dauphin thinks of Hal as a child. Here are your balls. Go play with them. Here's your ball. Two, it's an insult because I should give you a gift, but I'm giving you this pair of old tennis balls that mean nothing. Three, they mean let's play. We're going to play in terms of geopolitical warfare, right? It's also a form of visible repartee, I suppose, or what Norm Macdonald would call badinage, even though that's anachronistic because it's the wrong game. That's badminton, obviously. But it's a back and forth. And this is mirrored later in the play because when Hal goes to France and invades and beats the Dauphin, he then marries Catherine, the daughter of the French king, and they have a back and forth battle of wits, similar to a tennis match, hitting the ball back and forth across the net, if that makes sense. The net, obviously, would be if we were to put that in geopolitical terms, it would be the English Channel, right? It also is a nice bookend to Henry's life in the epic because the whole first section of his life is spent having this repartee with Falstaff. So in a way, what we see is that, W.H. Auden, the poet W.H. Auden questioned, why is Falstaff even in the play? And he was asking a rhetorical question. There are reasons for this. But he says, why is Falstaff even in the play? What does he accomplish? Well, one of the things that he accomplishes just by the nature of his existence and his relationship with Hal is that he trains Harry for his later role in the monarchy through his battle of wits. Everything that Falstaff says he never says anything by accident. Everything he says is meaningful, but he means what he says, but he chooses the meanings of his words, which is interesting because Falstaff is one of the highest IQ characters in Shakespeare, and it's because of his wit. Wit is important in Shakespeare, not just in the sense of humor. And humor is, as we've talked about before, humor, especially in Shakespeare, is a high IQ trait because it rests on, or it relies on, the sort of multiple directions of language and intention mixed with classical references, contemporary references, and it's meant to sting or gain the favor of the other person, but without doing too much or too little. It's pretty nimble. It's a nimble quality. Without being, without debasing yourself or the other person. And part of Falstaff, obviously, is this sort of debasement of himself. But that also functions in the role of uplifting Harry, who Harry or Hal is always going to be the king. And Falstaff knows that. But the interesting thing that Shakespeare does is, of course, that he doesn't disappoint his contemporary audience by having Falstaff on the stage in Henry V. Instead, we, the reader, or the audience then, or the audience now, we're told that Falstaff has died, penniless and essentially heartbroken. He's heartbroken because when Hal becomes Henry V and rises to become the king, his very first action is to dismiss Falstaff and to banish him from 10 miles from his sight, which is important because what he does is he's really saying that was then, this is now, right? That was my youth. This is my adulthood. I can have no more friends. Northrop Frye says that, kings can't have friends. Henry IV has no true friends. No king has friends. They have people that they need to please, right? Or people that they need to gain the favor of, people that they need to use, or foes, friends or foes, essentially. And Cleopatra is a great example of this. Remember Antony and Cleopatra? I mean, Cleopatra is a great example of this because she sizes up everyone that she meets within 30 seconds and how she can use them as part of her power. And so Hal banishes him. It's also supposed to be emblematic of the fact that, when you grow up, you leave the roost, right? You grow up and you leave your dad. Now Henry IV left Henry V, right? He left him. He died. He shuffled off his mortal coil. But now, because Falstaff is alive, it takes Hal to leave the sort of boar's head inn nest that he's been provided by Falstaff and his friends, and to assume roles and responsibilities that he always knew that he was meant for, and now he's going to become a great king. And Henry V was a great king. The Battle of Agincourt is the seminal moment one of the seminal moments in English history, but also obviously in the life of the play of Henry V, right? And that's what I was referring to when I was talking about the St. Crispin's Day speech, right? This band of brothers. So Henry V ends with his marriage, of course, to Catherine, and then we have a happy ending. So it's neither tragedy nor comedy. It's a history, but it's really a chronicle because it is in the personal viewpoint of these characters. Now, just a note on why Shakespeare is the way that it is. I'm not going to get into iambic pentameter and all that because we've discussed that sort of ad nauseum. But I will say that one of the reasons that they speak the way they do in the plays is because this is not how they really spoke, right? Obviously, historical figures did not speak in iambic pentameter, and they don't have the lines that Shakespeare gives them, right? This is his version of events. This is a chronicle. But what Shakespeare accomplishes with this, and what great literature accomplishes, is a lot of it may not be factual, but it is truthful. It is the poetry is, especially the poetry of Shakespeare, is the synthesis of all the situations and all the languages into its purest form. In other words, when the characters speak to each other, they are saying to each other what they always meant and always will mean to say to each other, not just in the life of the play, but for all time. Right. So, okay, occasionally historical figures have quotes that we can remember, but what we really remember is the lines that Shakespeare gave them. Right. So I think that's pretty interesting. And of course, this one thing that has to be said is that this is the reason that it's an epic also is because it is composed and performed around the time of Elizabeth, right? Elizabeth is the queen, and this is the golden age of Britain. This is after the victory in the Spanish Armada in 1588. So the plays were written about 1596. Henry IV Part 1 was 1596. And so we get this kind of, and this is obviously, there's a propaganda element to this, but it's also for a practical element because Shakespeare is writing to escape the censors at the time. And so what he's saying is that all of the English history has led up to this moment where Elizabeth is the queen. That's essentially what it is. And one of the genealogical things that happens there is that Henry V, when he dies, of course, his son Henry VI will take over. Henry VI will lead to Edward IV. Edward III was the father of, Edward III was the granddad, I think, of Richard II. His dad was Edward the Black Prince. The Black Prince because he was a scourge of the Scots and he wore black armor. And then anyway, Edward IV will take over. Followed by, Henry VI, Edward IV, followed by Richard III, who usurps the throne. Richard III is then followed by Henry VII, who is Henry Tudor, who is the first Tudor prince or first Tudor king, who then will be the father of Henry VIII, who then is the father of another Edward who dies. That's like Prince and the Pauper. That's what the Prince and the Pauper was based on. And then Mary, and then, of course, Elizabeth I becomes the queen, if that makes sense, if you can follow all that. And remember that Henry VIII was probably Shakespeare's final production during his lifetime. The theater burned down in the middle of the production. And his final written play was The Tempest. We've covered The Tempest and how Prospero is a Shakespearean character. He doesn't speak for Shakespeare. He's not. The characters all speak for Shakespeare, but Shakespeare is, in Harold Bloom's estimation, the two characters probably closest to Shakespeare himself are Falstaff and Hamlet. But Prospero does something which is extremely personally Shakespearean, which is he drowns his book, right? And that's the end of him. He retires 1613 and then dies in 1616. Okay, so Maddie says chemistry was easier for me than trying to keep these English royal genealogies straight. Yeah, I understand. I disagree because my chemistry teacher was a guy. I'm a total crayon eating slow boy when it comes to chemistry, but I do remember that my chemistry teacher was Mr. Cax. That's how you guys about that. He would. The way he taught was, his name was Mr. Cax. Brian, well, I shouldn't say his name. But I don't know if I can tell the story. He would say to people in the class, he would be like, look, now you're a little neutron and you're a little electron, and y'all two you're just gonna run right into each other, and you're just gonna be like little protons or whatever. We were like, what the fuck? No. Anyway, weird character. So anyway, let's see. Let's begin. Oh, and just to show you my reading material for this, and before we begin, we were going for 40 minutes. No, we're gonna keep going here, and my reading material for this stream was this. So we've got this book, Gnosticism and Neoplatonism in Shakespeare's plays, which I don't recommend. Not a great book. But I did get a couple things out of it, but it's redundant. And then this is a great book that I read, which is Northrop Frye on Shakespeare, who's one of the great academic literary scholars. Anatomy of Criticism, Fearful Symmetry, his seminal work on William Blake. But this one is Northrop Frye on Shakespeare. Of course, Harold Bloom's Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human, which I dove back into. And then the three plays, which I read in this. And this is funny because I picked up this complete works of Shakespeare just as a paperback copy I could kind of, throw around. I mean, I have, I don't know, maybe a dozen different complete works of Shakespeare, but I picked this one up because it was a cheap paperback. And then when I got it home, I noticed that it was signed by my aunt. It was formerly owned by my aunt. So we have a literary family. So also, quick shout out to everybody, and we're getting close here. This is going to be a big week, you guys. If you want to support me, please don't hesitate to click those links that my homies have dropped in the chat, or you can click the little down button in the video description, or go to the About page on the channel description and click any of those links. And you can help me out by donating through Venmo, PayPal, Cash App. Those get right to me. Those are helpful. I try not to use adverbs, but those are helpful. So thank you very much for that. And also, if you want to, you can also click the Super Chat link there. That's also helpful if you want your comments read, or you want to ask me any questions. Ask me anything about Shakespeare. Ask me any questions about Shakespeare or literature. That's my only skill. So yeah, no, go ahead. If you got something, drop a super chat. I also want to give a couple of shouts out to some of my homeboys out there who have really supported me big time. Shouts out to Jason out there, always supporting me. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you, homeboy. Shouts out to Pim. Shouts out to Countess. Love you, Countess. Shouts out to Kristen, Slow Boy Whiteboard, our homegirl. Shouts out to Buster for $25. Thank you for that awesome Venmo super chat. Really appreciate you. Says Henry IV stream. Let's see. Shouts out to Kristen out there for that $5 super chat. Really appreciate you on PayPal. Thank you so much, Kristen. Love you so much. Let's see. I got a couple other ones in here that I need to read. Shouts out to our homeboy out there, the real John Connor. Shouts out to John Connor out there, who donated $100. Big time super chatter. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you, homeboy. Let's see. Shouts out to Jason. Shouts out to Rita for that $20 super chat that you sent me this week. Really appreciate you. Shouts out to TGF who sent me $10. Thank you so much. Also, I'm getting to some of the sponsored streams, you guys. Shouts out to, Ryan and Presley for those sponsored streams. One of them that we're doing this week will be Your Arkansas Traveler and by Bud, what's his name? Bud Schulberg. The guy who wrote On the Waterfront, and also the film Facing the Crowd. They both deal with the same thing. You can read that short story, you guys, in about 15 minutes, and it's really good. It's really good. So, and that was an excellent recommendation. And we'll also be doing the novelization and the film of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I'm shutting your butt down, okay? Quentin Tarantino. And speaking of that Tarantino impression, you guys, tomorrow night, big time. We got something scheduled big time for tomorrow night. So hopefully you guys can come over to JD's channel and we'll be discussing literature. Really looking forward to that. Hope everybody can make it. That'll be a big one for us. So that'll be a lot of fun. We have lined up, I don't know what we're going to cover, but we have lined up The Wizard of Oz, the book, Return to Oz, the film, and maybe even Graham Greene's The Quiet American. So we're going to do that. So, yes, if you want to, Jerry says, but I never learned to read, though. It's okay. That's all right. you can just listen to my soft, buttery voice grating on your speakers, talking about Shakespeare, and maybe that's good enough. No, shouts out to our homeboy Jerry out there. We love you so much. And yes, if you want to do a sponsored stream, do like these Bazed people, Presley, Ryan, all these people do. And please drop, if you want me to do a film, drop $50. If you want me to do a book or a couple of books, drop $100. And please give me some recommendations, a list of things to choose from. I'll also be covering William Faulkner as part of that, but that'll be when I get down to Mississippi. And, of course, that'll be at the end of the week. I'll be heading down there to see my family. Thank goodness. It's time to get out of here and go on a little holiday, okay, and go on vacation and, go see the fam. So, and hopefully everybody will be enjoying a nice some family time over the next couple of weeks. So really appreciate y'all. So yes, again, if you want to donate, just use any of those links, and you can donate. You can donate not the super chat, but the other three ways anytime, and I will get it. And if you write me an email, I'll respond. My email address again is madmaximalism@gmail.com. MAXX, 2 X's, madmaximalism, 2 X's, gmail.com. And send me an email along with your super chat, and I'll get to that. Shouts out to Toledo, Maddie, all of our friends out there. Shouts out to my sister. Can't wait to see you. So, let's dive into Richard II. One thing I will say is that Richard II has the character Richard II is such a obviously all of Shakespeare's characters are poets. They're speaking the voice of the great literature. But what I mean here is that Richard II is a terrible king, but he becomes a greater poet as his life and his reign wanes. And he, of course, is locked in the Dark Tower. And one of the interesting things when we get into Henry is that Falstaff, of course, does not speak verse. He speaks prose, which is one reason why Harold Bloom loves Falstaff, because, his language is sort of the Titanic language of like Ahab. It reminds him of Ahab, of Moby Dick, not in terms of theme, but in terms of the gargantuan nature of his language, of his words, and of his speeches. One thing that Frye says is that the characters in Henry IV Part 2, especially Falstaff, will say, "I will be brief. Let me be brief." And then they'll speak for 2.5 hours. The only production I've seen of Henry IV was, I saw it at the Bristol Old Vic. I went to the Bristol Old Vic Theater School, and I saw it while I was in drama school there, and it was at the Bristol Old Vic professional production, and it starred, what's the guy's name in Trainspotting, who dies, and he also was in the show Rome. I can't remember his name, but it was. I was about to say it was great. It was not great. It was good, but he played Hotspur. Shakespeare makes a pun on this later. He says he refers to Hotspur as now Cold Spur. Huh, LOL, because he did. Right. So let's see. Richard II, I'm going to skip to the, let's see. One of the themes here is in Act 1, Scene 1, we're introduced to this theme of the crestfallen, this other Eden, this Demi-Paradise. So one of the things to keep in mind when you're reading the plays is that the thing that sets it apart as an epic is the continuous theme of the fact that the humans in the play, the characters, are always chasing an Edenic world. They want to get back to Eden. They want England to be an other Eden, as Richard II says, and they are going to make it so through the events that follow, going into this sort of golden age in terms of the literature, right? So, in other words, they have a sort of the play is not an allegory, but but it is a sort of it's what gives it an epic notion, this epic quality of searching for something higher, making themselves better, rising above their sort of base state of affairs. Now, the way that they do this is through geopolitical means and through straight up murder and treachery in a lot of ways. But what that also means is that they have to overcome murder and treachery from other characters. The epic is basically, what the epic means is basically that we have a work of literature that is magnificent in scope and length. We have the Odyssey, the Iliad, the Aeneid, the epic of Rome. We have the Song of Roland of France. We have the Divine Comedy of Italy. We have El Cid of Spain. And there are parallels, obviously, between the Song of Roland and El Cid because they're both fighting Saracens. And that is hinted at in Henry because, again, Henry IV wants to fund a crusade. He wants to go on the crusade. He wants Henry V to go on his crusade. They never do. Richard I, of course, the predecessor of Richard II, was on the crusade. Richard Coeur de Lion, which we covered in our Outremer Templar stream. But they can't ever get there because the events at home are too much. Now, that's one of the ironies, is that they want to go on the crusade in order to put a stop to the internal strife and the civil war that's going on at home. And the civil war is interesting because there is a biblical element in terms of what a civil war is. The civil war is essentially comes from, in the play, the archetype of Cain and Abel. So, in other words, in Act 1, Act 1, Scene 1, the very beginning of the play, Richard, I think this is Richard's long speech. Richard says, no, this is Mowbray. Mowbray says, sluiced out his innocent soul through streams of blood, which blood, like sacrificing Abel's, cries even from the tongueless caverns of the earth, to me for justice and rough chastisement, and by the glorious worth of my descent, the arm shall do it, or this life be spent. So, and of course we end in the perfect couplet. And what he's saying there is that Cain's murder of Abel is the archetype for the Civil War and all civil wars to come, brother against brother, right? And that Cain's deed cries out from the earth, and that Cain is then forced to wander the earth, right? Remember Samuel L. Jackson in Pulp Fiction? I'm going to wander the earth like Cain. Cain is forced to wander the earth. Of course, there are allusions to the other great British epic, Beowulf, right, where Grendel is the child of Grendel's mother, and Grendel's mother is the offspring of Cain in the poem. And so the other thing that we get out of this is that we have this fight between Bolingbroke and, who is it, Percy? No, Mowbray. Between Bolingbroke and Thomas Mowbray. And Mowbray, when they fight, Bolingbroke is then cursed by the king, not literally cursed, but he is sent out on exile not to return for 6 years. And then we have, there's continuous talk throughout the plays of the king being anointed. Now, the monarch in England is literally anointed. And this is supposed to be this is supposed to be an exemplar of Christ, the Messiah, being anointed, and the king, especially in terms of feudalism, the king, the divine right of kings, that the king of England is supposed to be God's representative. And so the destabilization and the civil war is supposed to be a threat to that, and they have to overcome it. He says, also, one thing that I noticed throughout the plays is like the Shakespeare in terms of Shakespeare's own voice. When you read enough Shakespeare, when you read enough of any author, it's like you know how the author. We know, for instance, from reading Cormac McCarthy, right? We did The Passenger, we did No Country for Old Men, we did Blood Meridian, and Cormac McCarthy has a specific voice as a writer, right? His use of language, his diction, his syntax, the way that he speaks, the spaces in between speech are indicative of McCarthy's voice as a writer, and you start to notice that. You don't start to notice it. If you read enough Shakespeare, you notice it right away. And I don't just mean in a way that's like, oh, we've got iambic pentameter. All the Elizabethans wrote in iambic pentameter, right? But the thing that separates, for instance, Christopher Marlowe or John Webster from Shakespeare. And one thing that's interesting is that in Henry the Fourth, I think part two, Shakespeare specifically quotes Marlowe. I mean, they were contemporaries, but of course Marlowe died 3 years before Henry IV Part 1 was composed. Also, the plays are meant to be performed right away. They are meant to be performed on stage. But again, we have these cane elements that occur throughout. For instance, let's see, Mowbray says at the end of Act 1, then thus I turn me from my country's light to dwell in solemn shades of endless night. Or as Jim Morrison says when he quotes Celine, right? Take the highway to the end of the night. And let's see, later on, Bolingbroke will say, Norfolk, so far as to mine enemy, by this time had the king permitted us, one of our souls had wandered in the air, banished this frail sepulchre of our flesh, and now our flesh is banished from this land. The sepulchre is an obvious biblical reference here, but it's also Gnostic in a way, because he's talking about the sepulchre as the prison. The flesh is the prison of your soul, and thus you need to transcend. You need to transcend your status in life in order to bring light and life back to the land, if that makes sense. But I don't think that these plays are not. But there are plenty of Shakespeare plays that are Gnostic in terms of our analysis. For instance, The Tempest is heavily Gnostic. But yes, Toledo, is Shakespeare the pen name of other writers? Did he even exist? Yes, Shakespeare existed. He's not the pen name of other writers. There was not a committee that wrote Shakespeare. He was a real person who was also fairly ruthless in his financial dealings. Shakespeare was a member of the Lord Chamberlain's men, and then the King's men, with a will and legal documents. And it's funny because most of the things that people question about Shakespeare deal with the one writer who said that this Shakespeare, this upstart crow. Right, this one comment this one dude wrote about Shakespeare because he couldn't get his plays produced like Shakespeare did. Francis Bacon was a real person who also wrote. Christopher Marlowe died in 1593. He was assassinated, probably by Francis Walsingham's men. And it's interesting also, one thing that I realized reading the plays is that the sonnets themselves, which are dedicated to the Earl of Southampton, in part, were the sonnets themselves, in a way, are Falstaffian. I mean, the sentiments involved in the sonnets are certainly written with a voice. They're written with a particular character and a patron in mind, and with a particular voice. But many of them are Falstaffian in terms of their sentiments, which I had never thought of before. Let's see, the famous speech, which gives us the Hollow Crown on page 388. Which is, let's see, this is page 388 of this complete works, Act 2, Scene 1. And this is John of Gaunt. Now, John of Gaunt, of course, John of Gaunt is the father of Henry Bolingbroke, and we hear about John of Gaunt even now. This is why a lot of this is I know, Toledo, yeah, no problem. A lot of what we see now, especially in terms of geopolitical struggle and the Machiavellian nature of politics. Shakespeare mentions Machiavelli. I don't know if Shakespeare read Machiavelli, but he certainly knew of Machiavelli, and even in Hamlet, he refers to someone as a Machiavel. And one of the things that we hear about is how John of Gaunt. I think Hilary Crimeton, trademark, claims to be a descendant of John of Gaunt, which is not surprising. I mean, he had a bunch of kids, and they were a powerful family. You know, people are related. But John of Gaunt is the father of Henry Bolingbroke. And John of Gaunt is like one of those seminal figures in Shakespeare and in English history. And John of Gaunt says in Act 2, Scene 1, he says, more are men's ends marked than their lives before. The setting sun and music at the close. At the last taste of sweets is sweetest last. Writ in remembrance more than things long past. With eager feeding, let's see, he says, light vanity, insatiate cormorant, consuming means soon preys upon itself. This royal throne of kings, this sceptered isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, this other Eden, Demi-Paradise, this fortress built by nature for herself against infection in the hand of war, this happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone set in the silver sea, which serves it in the office of a wall, or as a moat defensive to a house against the envy of less happier lands, this blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England, this nurse, this teeming womb of royal kings, feared by their breed and famous by their birth, renowned for their deeds as far from home, for Christian service and true chivalry, as is the sepulchre in stubborn Jewry of the world's ransom, blessed Mary's son, this land of such dear souls, this dear, dear land, dear for her reputation through the world, is now leased out. I die pronouncing it, like to a tenement or pelting farm, England, bound in with the triumphant sea, whose rocky shore beats back the envious siege of watery Neptune, is now bound with shame, with inky blots and rotten parchment bonds. That England, that was wont to conquer others, hath made a shameful conquest of itself. Ah, would the scandal vanish with my life, how happy then were my ensuing death. So what he's saying here is that England, in the worldview of the play and in the geopolitical worldview and in terms of England's history and of the apotheosis of Henry, is the sceptered isle, right? A demi-paradise walled off from everyone else. And it's walled off, of course, by the shores of England. I mean, by the shores of Britain. But it is interesting, you know, I mean, it is interesting to consider that this island, right, has not been conquered since 1060. It's been almost 1,000 years, right? And it's just this island right off of Europe, and it's European, but it's separate from Europe, right? It's and that's one of the things that sets the stage. It sort of foreshadows Henry's conquest of France, right, in the Battle of Agincourt. They can't come here, but we can go there and conquer. He says, he compares, let's see, Henry IV's exile to a pilgrimage. Pilgrimage must be for the Irish wars. He has to go and, of course, conquer and defeat the Irish, mainly for obviously for the buffer zone of their future empire, and you know the Anglo-Irish, the British Isles, but also it's kind of interesting to think of it as a practice run, right, for future wars and to protect against civil war like the U.S. and Vietnam, right, which, you know, Valentine goes into so much in the Phoenix program, but it's essentially the same thing. It's weird how, you know, history, I don't know if history repeats itself. I don't mean that. I just mean that the history repeating itself in terms of the strategies and their intention with that, right? Go off to this place because it will stave off the inevitable civil war if you don't. Let's see. Signs and wonders are mentioned throughout. I see that this is end of Act 2. I see thy glory like a shooting star fall to the base earth from the firmament. Thy sun sets weeping in the lowly west, witnessing storms to come, woe and unrest. Thy friends are fled to wait upon thy foes, and crossly to thy good all fortune goes. Firmament and witnessing are interesting in that speech, because that little excerpt, because they are, in iambic pentameter, we get, depending on the form and the content working together to produce meaning, we often get monosyllabic words depending on the simplicity of the sentiment, or the intention, or whatever the speaker is saying here, right? But right here we get the polysyllabic terms, especially of firmament and witnessing. Firmament, witnessing, right? Trisyllabic words that indicate something greater in terms of the length of the line of verse, right? Something above, something beyond. In other words, they live in this sceptered isle, but there is something beyond it, whether that be beyond in terms of conquest, or beyond in terms of their, kind of transcendence, Henry's apotheosis to become king, or transcendence in terms of, and I don't mean like a kind of a Buddhist transcendence. I just mean their transcendence in terms of their rising to something greater in life, right? Whether that be pursuing virtue, for the sake of the nation, or for the life of the nation, conquest for the life of the nation, what have you. Or for the king, at least his intention in, in serving God and being good to his people. Let's see, Act 2. This is Act 2, Scene 2. King Richard II says, "No matter where of comfort no man speak, let's talk of graves, of worms, of epitaphs. Make dust our paper, and with rainy eyes write sorrow on the bosom of the earth. Let's choose executors in talks of wills, and yet not so. For what can we bequeath save our deposed bodies to the ground, our lands, our lives, and all our Bolingbroke's? And nothing can we call our own but death, and that small model of the barren earth which serves as paste and cover to our bones. For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings, how some have been deposed, some slain war, some haunted by the ghosts they have deposed, some poisoned by their wives, some sleeping, killed, all murdered. For within the hollow crown that rounds the mortal temples of a king keeps death his court. And there, let's see, he says, allowing him a breath, a little scene to monarchize, be feared, and kill with looks, infusing him with self and vain conceit, as if this flesh which walls about our life were brass impregnable. And humor thus comes at the last, and with a little pin bores through his castle wall, and farewell, king, cover your heads, and mock not flesh and blood with solemn reverence. Throw away respect, tradition, form, and ceremonious duty, for you have mistook me all this while. I live with bread like you, feel want, taste grief, need, friends. Subjected thus, how can you say to me, I am a king?" Really, I mean, so in other words, Richard is saying, and remember, I said that he gets more poetic as he goes on, as he falls. But what he's saying here is that, yes, though he is a king, he's a human being, and he needs all the things that other people need, which is ironic because one of the things that will make the great kings is their lack of friends, at least in the Machiavellian sense. Right, that's the one thing Henry V does at the start of his reign, as we discussed with Falstaff. But he's saying there essentially that, right, there's a time to die, right? There's nothing new under the sun. All this stuff happens. There's a time to die, and it's going to happen. There's a phrase I liked in the next scene where Bolingbroke's speech is contrasted with Richard II's, of course, and he says, if not, I'll use the advantage of my power and lay the summer's dust with showers of blood rain from the wounds of slaughtered Englishmen, the which, how far off from the mind of Bolingbroke it is, such crimson tempest should bedrench the fresh green lap of fair King Richard's land. So it's showing you that while Richard says, down, down I come like glistening Phaethon, right? Wanting the manage of unruly jades. He doesn't understand. He's not a great king because he doesn't understand what it takes to to hold his land together. And Bolingbroke is ruthless enough to do this. Henry IV, of course, is played, I think, he's played in The Hollow Crown by Jeremy Irons, who plays him so well. I mean, there's a scene in part 1 of Henry IV where Hal and Falstaff, or no, it's Hal and Poins notoriously like mock his dad, Henry IV, right? And they do it pretty well in it's kind of meta in The Hollow Crown because what's his name? Hiddleston can do a great impression of Jeremy Irons. No, I say to you, right, that Jeremy Irons voice. By the way, I met Jeremy Irons, and that's because the Hollow Crown I liked because there were a number of actors from my drama school in it, including Jeremy Irons and my friend Sam Rukin. Sam Rukin plays one of he's got not a major speaking role, but he's throughout on film in The Hollow Crown. He plays one of Richard's entourage. Sam Rukin was the bad guy in that show Turn, and he was also in he actually his newest thing is, have you guys seen the like Call of Duty meme, right, with the guy, the face, right, the skull face? That's him. That's Sam Rukin. He's in the new film version. Anyway, he was a classmate of mine. But Jeremy Irons is in it. And he's great. But I actually thought that the guy who played Henry IV, however briefly, in The King, was great. What's his name, you guys? I got to look it up because I can't remember his name. He's Australian. Ben Mendelsohn. I just remembered. Ben Mendelsohn. Ben Mendelsohn is great as Henry IV in The King with Timothée Chalamet because he plays this decrepit, ruthless old Henry Bolingbroke, who's just like, eaten through with sores and plague, and wants to leave his son in the dust until Henry proves himself, of course. But he's just this. They hate each other, those two, and I thought that he played him really well, even though it's not a Shakespearean production. It's a take on Shakespeare. I really liked him. I thought that he played him really well. He reminded me kind of a sort of an Edward Longshanks. What's the guy's name? Jeff, what's the guy's name who plays Edward Longshanks in Braveheart? Oh, gosh, I can't remember the guy's name now because I'm thinking of too many names in this. But the trouble with Scotland is that it's full of Scots, right? Speaking of Scotland, you guys, have you seen, excuse me, folks. Excuse me. Look, cheers out, everybody out there. Have you guys seen, listen, I'm not bragging, but I've seen the movie London Has Fallen a number of times. It's very esoteric in the common parlance. Have you guys seen London Has Fallen? It's a great movie. It's great bad, but it's a great movie. What was Norm Macdonald's take on Olympus Has Fallen? But London Has Fallen is great because there's this scene where that's just my regular voice, folks. It's funny because that doesn't affect my voice at all. Doing a Jeremy Irons voice, right? Doing a Jeremy. How does Jeremy Irons talk? Jeremy Irons. Oh, I didn't finish my story about Jeremy Irons. Anyway, I'll finish that in a minute. Or doing an AJ doesn't affect my voice at all. But London Has Fallen is great because there's a scene, my sister said it, where Jerry Butler, he's talking to the Scottish SAS guy, and he says, things are about to get sporty. And it's like, people have a hard time doing an American accent. They just think, generically, people always obviously mock the American doing the English accent, but it's the same this way, It's like, no, you just change your T's to D's and it's an American accent. No. And I when I first saw the movie, I saw it in the theater, and I really thought that he said, things are about to get sporty. Like, that's how he sounds to me. Yes, thank you, Toledo. Patrick McGowan did an amazing job as Edward Longshanks. And he throws Edward II's friend, his advisor. Who is this man and why is he, right? He defenestrates him. And of course, Edward II and Richard II are two of the famous Skittles kangs. But even back then, things are about to get sporty. Anyway, I met Jeremy Irons because when I was in drama school, it was the 50th anniversary of Les Mis. Oh, there's an 8:30 matinee of Les Mis. Because Les Mis was produced by Cameron Mackintosh. I forget what it had to do with the Old Vic. Maybe it was first produced at the Old Vic, or I don't remember what it is. But Cameron Mackintosh was there, and it was the 50-year anniversary. He wrote. He didn't write Les Mis. That was Victor Hugo, but he wrote the stage play. And anyway, it was this big to do or whatever. And Jeremy Irons and Patrick, I told you guys about how Patrick Stewart almost ran over me in his Range Rover, and then he came to do a talk to all of us, actors or whatever. Anyway, but Jeremy Irons was there. It was very nice. He was at the garden party. Hello, I remember Rudy Shelley. I remember. Yes, I remember Rudy Shelley training. I can't do it, Jeremy Irons. Dang, I gotta listen to his voice more. But he talked about Rudy Shelley training him. Rudy Shelley was this great teacher at the Old Vic. Anyway, so that wasn't really a great story. Sorry. Yeah, Christian Bale does a really good American accent. No, Christian Bale is Welsh. Christian Bale is Welsh. Of course, he does an American accent. Probably he does one, but he didn't go to drama school. He does probably one better because, of course, he did. What's his name? What's the guy's name? Hold on. What's the guy's name who wrote The Empire of the Sun? J.G. Ballard. We just covered J.G. Ballard. Anyway, he did J.G. Ballard's Empire of the Sun when he was young with Malcatraz. Maybe that's where he picked up his good American accent. I don't think he went to drama school, though. But, yes, and Mel Gibson. Mel Gibson's Australian, but I think he moved to America when he was pretty young. Not that young, but still pretty young. Mel Gibson obviously does a great American accent. Christian Bale does a great American accent. Daniel Day-Lewis hasn't done much of an American accent. I mean, he did, of course, he didn't really do an American accent. He did a John Huston accent in There Will Be Blood, and then he played Lincoln. But Daniel Day-Lewis can do an American accent. Australians can do an American accent for some reason really well. Maybe they just have good. Maybe they just have good speech coaches like we did at school. Gary, shouts out to Gary out there. So let's see. Get back to this. Henry. The last thing I'll cover probably about Henry IV, Part 1, is that he gives his speech where he foreshadows the fact that he's going to give up his wayward ways, his drinking, whoring, gambling, drugging, all that stuff. And he says, "I know you all, and will a while uphold the unyoked humor of your idleness. Yet therein will I imitate the sun. Yet who doth permit the base contagious clouds to smother up his beauty from the world, that when he please again to be himself, being wanted, he may be more wondered at, by breaking through the foul and ugly mists of vapors that did seem to strangle him. If all the year were playing holidays, to sport would be as tedious as to work. But when they seldom come, they wished for come, and nothing pleaseth but rare accidents. So when this loose behavior I throw off, and pay the debt I never promised, by how much better than my word I am, by so much shall I falsify men's hopes. And like bright metal on a sullen ground, my reformation, glittering o'er my fault, shall show more goodly and attract more eyes than that which hath no foil to set it off. I'll so offend to make offense a skill, redeeming time when men think least I will." In other words, this is pretty insightful of the young Hal here. He says essentially that, yeah, I know I'm doing all this stuff. I know I'm bad boy or whatever, hanging out with Falstaff, but when the time comes, I'm going to throw all this off so that I can imitate the sun. Of course, this is like the Sun King right? This is, which is kind of foreshadowing a sort of his conflict with what later becomes Louis, right? But the king is going to shine like the sun in terms of he's going to illuminate his kingdom, right, with his presence and his rule. And literally his armor will be glittering in the sun at the height of the Battle of Agincourt, in which Henry actually fought, right? The last monarch to die in battle was Richard III. Remember they found Richard III's bones under that parking lot a few years ago? I think they verified that. They were actually Richard's bones. Right. Then let's to it pell-mell. If not to heaven, then hand in hand to hell, he says in his final speech. My horse, my kingdom for a horse. I found actually somewhere in here where that also is foreshadowed. Somebody wishes for a horse, a horse. Let's see. In Act, let's see, is this Act 1? In Act 1, I found more echoes of Cain and treachery in the Civil War archetype. It says, let's see, this is Northumberland, who says, to feed contention in a lingering act, but let one spirit of the firstborn Cain reign in all bosoms, that each heart being set on bloody courses, the rude scene may end, and darkness be the barrier of the dead. So again, we're foreshadowing Cain here. We have Plutonic hell imagery in Act 2, Scene 4. Pistol says, I'll see thee damned first to Pluto's damned lake, by this hand to the infernal deep, with Erebus and tortures vile also, hold hook and line, say I, down, down, dogs, down, fates. And then we have comparisons between Falstaff and Satan here in Act 2, Scene 4. It says, Falstaff says, the fiend hath pricked down Bardolph irrecoverable, and his face is Lucifer's privy kitchen, where he doth nothing but roast malworms. For the boy, there is a good angel about him, but the devil outbids him too. So Harold Bloom says that Falstaff is neither a devil nor an angel. He's I would say that he's sort of a representation of the humanistic joie de vivre, zest for life, but humanistic pre-Enlightenment and Renaissance figure of the human being in the so-called brotherhood of man, right? But he does certainly have a kind of a Luciferian, daemon edge to him, in the sense that Henry IV, his dad, on one shoulder, and then he's got Falstaff on the other shoulder, and he sort of transcends both of those. It's not like one's an angel, one's a devil. They're kind of both devils in a way, but he has to sort of rise above both of them. And I mean, Henry V will deny, and will sort of shove off the influence of both of those characters later in Henry V. He is a sort of prototypical new king who is want to throw off the influence or any kind of lingering influence of the civil wars of his youth and England prior to his youth. Let's see. Oh, that was Henry IV Part 2 that I was quoting. Let's do one Falstaff speech. Falstaff's soliloquy. This is Henry IV Part 2, Act 4, Scene 3. He says, I would you had but the wit, 'twere better than your dukedom. Good faith, this same young sober-blooded boy doth not love me, nor a man cannot make him laugh. But that's no marvel, he drinks no wine. There's never none of these demure boys come to any proof, for thin drink doth so overcool their blood, and making many fish meals, that they fall into a kind of a male green sickness. And then when they marry, they get wenches. They are generally fools and cowards, which some of us should be too, but for inflammation. is that Prince Harry is valiant. For the cold blood he did naturally inherit of his father, he hath like lean, sterile, and bare, and manured, husbanded, and tilled, with excellent endeavor of drinking good and good store of fertile sherries, that he has become very hot and valiant. If I had 1,000 sons, the first human principle I would teach them should be to forswear thin potatoes and to addict themselves to sack. Sack means wine. And the reason he says that is because Falstaff, and this is one of the things they try to do in the movie The King. One of the things that Falstaff is wary of is war, is the idea not of honor itself, right, of virtuous honor, but really the way that the nobles continuously talk about honor, because their life is all about death, in that they think that the high point of death is to die glorious on the battlefield. And so be it. But Falstaff says basically, you remember he's Sir John Falstaff, he's a knight. It's like he's seen war, he knows what war is like. So all of their talk about honor and dying on the battlefield is kind of mishmash to him, in the sense that he wants to live, okay? And that's why I said that he's one of the great, like, humanistic characters. But it does transcend that, in that he is right in a way. I mean, he wants to live life, and he thinks that the petty squabbles of the nobles can be overcome by sort of in this, it's sort of, to say egocentric is like way too little of a way to describe him. But what he finds out is that Henry gets over those things by winning on the battlefield, and then by settling the differences ruthlessly through his monarchy, if that makes sense. There's a great quote in here by Henry before the battle begins. And he says, let's see, it's in is it Henry IV? He says, let me see if I can find this. I'm trying to navigate through like 1,000 pages of small print here. He says, hold on. Oh my gosh, where is it? He gets to the battle and he says, they remark on the weather. And then he says, hold on, you guys. I'm sorry. Talk amongst yourselves. Talk amongst yourselves. Ovaltine is neither oval nor round. Discuss. Speaking of which, did I tell you guys I saw Seinfeld? I saw Seinfeld in stand-up last week. Was that just last week? With my homeboy? I think I told you guys about that. But he did a 30-minute bit about raisins. Yeah, I'm just going to make it up. Yeah, he says essentially, the guy says, look, man, it's a foul day. And he says, it's not foul if you win, right? We're winners. I think I put it in the description of the video. And I hate to paraphrase it. I hate paraphrasing Shakespeare. But that's essentially what he says. Anyway, I guess I said it would be a mammoth stream. But, I mean, that's about it for the histories. I mean, does anybody, you guys got any comments or questions? I think that, you know, to do a complete Falstaffiad would take another, I don't know, would take a whole other stream. But I think that it's important to keep in mind that, you know, that the histories are an interesting chronicle, and have sort of seeped their way into, public consciousness as history itself. Yeah, Northrop Frye says on page 60 of this book, Shakespeare often comes curiously close to Machiavelli's The Prince. Curiously, because it is practically impossible that Shakespeare could have known Machiavelli's writings, and because Shakespeare's social vision is a deeply conservative one, whereas Machiavelli's was realistic enough to make the horrified idealists of his time give him a reputation in England and elsewhere as the voice of the devil himself. We've done Machiavelli, right? He comes in, for example, to emit cynical sentiments as the prologue speaker of Marlowe's Jew of Malta, but the theorist and the dramatist converge on 2 points. the dramatic nature of leadership and the fact that the qualities of the born leader are not moral qualities. In ancient times, stage actors literally, usually wore masks. And we've talked about the mask before when we did our Oedipal streams. One thing Frye says about Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, that's interesting is that the two plays are experiential. In fact, they kind of go back to a sort of a primitive, a more primitive version of theater. Shakespeare really does this towards the end of his career with Cymbeline and Timon of Athens. And he sort of goes back into the primitive nature of theater in terms of trying to not have a ritualistic element like the Greeks did, but in terms of changing theater because his oeuvre was so big, right? His body of work was so large that he couldn't help but comment on things that he'd previously written. Toledo says, I really like Laurence Olivier's version of King Richard III and Henry V. They're classics. Yeah. I like the version of Henry what does he say? He says, now with the winter of our discontent, right? No, do it normal. Do it normal. Now with the winter of our discontent. Richard, I love Olivier. And one of the things that Olivier did in terms of the propaganda elements of Henry V is, of course, that he was, obviously in America we had Lookout Mountain and we had Livermore Labs and we had Jimmy Stewart being a glowy and making films, and Ronald Reagan being hired by the War Department to make propaganda films and everything. But one thing Laurence Olivier did in the English version was he was hired by the British establishment and their own War Department and psyops to do a production of Henry V that would jazz the British public, that would increase morale. Because obviously Henry V has echoes of, this band of brothers, this England, right, where we're all united against a common foe in Europe. Of course, France is the enemy, and France was the ally at that point. But apparently it was a huge success and worked. I love Laurence Olivier. Laurence Olivier founded my drama school, and I like Laurence Olivier because of his sort of the divergence between Olivier as a classical actor and the method acting of the American school, right? BLA, John Adams says, BLA, who are those busts on your bookshelves? I can't tell on my tiny little iPhone screen. That is Alexander. That's Alexander the Great. And that right there is TJ. That's Thomas Jefferson. That's Thomas Jefferson. Because I'm a Virginian. Hello? Yes, it's Thomas Jefferson because I'm Virginian. And Alexander because I've always liked Alexander. Let's see. My sister said, what did my sister say? Nicole Kidman can't do an American accent. Yes, she's absolutely right. She does a terrible American accent. Also, what was I reading about about Kidman recently? That she's doing a production of something which echoed the Anthony Kidman stuff. And, more Eyes Wide Shut-esque activity. I can't wait to see, just on a tangent, you guys, just to riff with you, I can't wait to see this movie Babylon that's coming out about the 20s and the, golden age of Hollywood with Brad Pitt. Because, you just know, I wonder how much Kenneth Anger there is in the film. Right, because of Hollywood Babylon. Hollywood Babylon. Hollywood Babylon. I got Hollywood Babylon in the other room, in my other library. You guys should read that book. It's pretty interesting. Yes, it's about Fatty Arbuckle. That's how people mainly associate it. But there are interesting stories about Rudolph Valentino being a pervert, and about the various heroin addictions of a lot of the stars in the 20s. So, I'm interested to see what this movie Babylon's going to do. Also, speaking of another film that I don't know if anybody has seen it, and I doubt if anybody will see it. My sister saw it, and then I saw it, and then Jethro saw it. and it's the movie Amsterdam, which is pretty interesting. I wonder if JD will do an analysis on that because it's another movie with Christian Bale. It's a David O. Russell movie. It's got freaking everybody in it. Even Swifty shows up. Right. But it is revelatory. It's not a great movie at all. But it is revelatory because it's about our boy Smedley Butler. Oh, you want me to play Smedley Butler here, huh? That was sort of a Brando, Robert De Niro. He plays Smedley Butler, and it's about the bankers' coup, the conspiracy. And there's a few scenes. One where they are clearly either taking a Duino or something, and the girl from The Witch is talking about the Vril Society. And I don't know, it's pretty revelatory. It's got some pretty revelatory scenes in it. There's just nothing else out, right? There's just like nothing. There's no like films. Yeah, Toledo says that was Brando. Listen. What is the oh yeah, speaking of Brando, I mentioned how we're going to do a Face in the Crowd, which is by Elia Kazan, and Bud Schulberg was also a snitch in the McCarthy things, but he was also a communist, or at least former communist. I don't know, whatever. But the screenplay is or the short story is revelatory. We'll get into that. But he wrote On the Waterfront, of course, right? I could have been somebody. A one-way ticket to Palookaville, which is what Mark Wahlberg echoes in his end speech in the Mirror in Boogie Nights, right? I haven't seen any of White Lotus. Yeah, there's just not much. I mean, I'm constantly watching movies and, watching shows and reading and, obviously. But there's just, give us some films, right? Give us some good movies to watch. Anyway, guys, I think that's going to wrap it up for tonight. That's about all the Shakespeare I got in me for tonight. So that was Richard II, Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, and then Henry V. And now that was a pretty basic. I don't know if it was so basic. I mean, we weren't doing a review of the plays, obviously, we weren't doing a review of the film and the TV show. We were basically just talking about. We were doing a deeper analysis to discuss the geopolitical events, the worldview. Relevance to today, Henry's apotheosis, what an epic poem is, what an epic is in the first place, and just talking Shakespeare. And I think we covered those things pretty well. So I think that'll about cover it. Let's check one more time for super chats and stuff. And again, I hope y'all have a good week this week. I know tomorrow, of course, again, just a reminder, please tune in to... I know everybody will be there anyway because it's JD, but please tune into JD over at Jay Dyer's channel because we'll be doing an analysis of some literature, and that's going to be fun, y'all. I hope to see y'all there. That should be a lot of fun. I'll be doing my Facing the Crowd analysis later this week. We'll probably have something else coming up. And let's see if we got any other super chats that came in. Shouts out to our homeboy, John Adams. Thank you, John. Appreciate you, homeboy, who says, Francis, anon, sir. Anon, sir. Let's see. Behold, the dapple, what is it? Behold, the gentle wheels of Phoebus round about dapple the drowsy east with spots of gray. It's from Much Ado About Nothing. And let's see if we got any other... super chats here. Let me check the little thing here. You guys. And let me check right here. If I forgot a super chat, please forgive me and I will get back to it. I don't see any other super chats, you guys. So let me know if I missed any. I think that's it. Shouts out to everybody who's donated and who always support me. Thank you so much. Thank you again to John Connor and John Adams and all of our homeboys out there and homegirls. Thank you so much. Really appreciate y'all. And I will see you tomorrow night Oh yes, one more thing. Also, we should be doing another Coteasy stream. We're going to be with our homeboy Church of the Eternal Logos, David Patrick Harry, who will be doing a Christmas stream, talking about some Christmas literature, A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, and maybe some films. Maybe Scrooged. I don't know yet, but I think that might be at the end of the week. Yes. Kristen, I did. I gave you a shouts out, and thank you again for that beautiful, wonderful super chat. Thank you so much for that $5 PayPal. I really appreciate you as always. Thank you so much. Thank you to Kristen. Thanks to Buster. Thanks to John Adams. Thanks to John Connor, the real John. That's the real John Connor out there. Shouts out to everyone out there who's donated and who supports me. Really appreciate y'all. And again, I will see you tomorrow night over at JD, and I hope you all have a beautiful, beautiful, wonderful. I hope you have a beautiful, wonderful week. Really special. Okay, that's about all I got. Thanks, y'all. I love you.